my gold-digging granddaughter's wedding, they handed me a name tag that read, "The Absent Old Lady." I smiled and pinned it to my dress as if it meant nothing. "I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from. I'd like to know how far this story travels. I've always believed weddings were meant to bring families closer. To remind us of what we've built together, what we've sacrificed to get there." My granddaughter Emily's wedding was supposed to be one of those days. The kind you hold on to when everything else starts slipping away. I'm 70 years old. I've buried a husband, raised a son, and helped raise that very girl who now stood at the center of a room filled with white roses and crystal chandeliers. I paid for her piano lessons when her parents said they couldn't afford them. I watched her every summer while they took their vacations. I was there for the scraped knees, the science fairs, the nights she cried over her first heartbreak. Absent. That word sat against my chest heavier than the brooch I'd worn for 20 years. The ballroom at the Grand Willows Hotel shimmered with soft golden light. Waiters moved gracefully between tables, carrying champagne flutes and delicate plates of hors d'oeuvres. Laughter filled the air, light, effortless, belonging to people who felt they deserved to be there. I walked slowly past the check-in table, aware of the way the young hostess hesitated when she saw my name tag. Her smile flickered, just for a second. Not confusion. Recognition. That's when I knew. This wasn't a mistake. I took my seat at table 12, near the back. Not with family. Not even with relatives. Strangers. People who glanced at my name tag, then quickly away, as if politeness could erase what had already been read. Across the room, I spotted my son, Daniel. He stood beside his wife, Claire, greeting guests with wide, practiced smiles. Emily stood between them, radiant and white, laughing at something one of her friends said. None of them looked at me. Not once. I folded my hands neatly in my lap. My posture straight. My expression calm. Because after 70 years, you learn something important. Sometimes, the loudest truths aren't spoken. They're printed. And worn, for everyone to see. I sat there for a long time without moving, my fingers lightly resting against the edge of the tablecloth. It was linen, high quality, carefully pressed. The kind of detail I used to notice with quiet satisfaction. Tonight, it felt different. Everything did. A woman across from me adjusted her bracelet and offered a polite smile. Beautiful ceremony, isn't it? She said, her eyes briefly flicking down to my name tag before returning to my face. I nodded. It is. My voice sounded steady. Even to me. But I could feel it, the shift in the room. Not loud. Not obvious. Just small things. Glances that lingered a second too long. Conversations that lowered when I passed nearby. A man at the next table leaned toward his wife and whispered something. She pressed her lips together, trying not to smile. I didn't need to hear the words. I already knew what they saw when they looked at me. The absent old lady. Absent. As if I hadn't spent years showing up when no one else would. As if presence could be measured by who stood in the spotlight, instead of who stood behind it. A server placed a glass of champagne in front of me. I thanked him quietly, though I had no intention of drinking it. My hands remained still, folded neatly in my lap. Across the room, I watched Emily move from table to table, her white dress catching the light with every step. People reached for her, laughed with her, pulled her into photographs. She looked happy. Effortlessly so. For a moment, I allowed myself to remember a different version of her. A little girl with tangled hair and scraped knees, running into my kitchen after school. "Grandma, I'm hungry," she used to say, dropping her backpack by the door like it had betrayed her. I would already have something ready. I always did. Those afternoons weren't grand. No chandeliers. No champagne. Just peanut butter sandwiches, warm soup in the winter, and the quiet rhythm of being needed. I wondered, not for the first time, when that version of me had become invisible. Or worse, rewritten. A burst of laughter pulled me back. Claire stood near the bar now, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm. She said something to a group of guests, then tilted her head just enough for them to see me. It was subtle. Practiced. One of the women followed her gaze, then looked at my name tag. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Not shock. Not confusion. Recognition. And then, amusement. I looked down at the card pinned to my dress. The letters were elegant. Careful. Someone had taken time with it. Chosen the wording. Approved the design. Printed it. Placed it exactly where I would receive it. This wasn't thoughtless. This was deliberate. I lifted my glass then, just slightly, watching the bubbles rise to the surface before setting it back down untouched. There's a particular kind of silence that comes when something inside you settles. Not breaks. Not shatters. Settles. Like dust after a long disturbance. I felt it then. That stillness. That clarity. Because sitting there, surrounded by strangers at a wedding I had helped make possible, I realized something that changed everything. They weren't just telling a joke. They were telling a story about me. And for the first time, I started to wonder who had been writing it all along. I didn't have to wait long to find out. The truth has a way of revealing itself, especially when people think you're not paying attention. Dinner was served shortly after the speeches began. Plates of filet mignon and roasted vegetables were placed in front of us with quiet precision. The kind of meal meant to impress. The kind I had paid for, though no one had said that out loud. Not yet. I picked up my fork, more out of habit than hunger. Around me, conversations picked up again, softer now, more personal. That's when I heard it. 2 seats to my left. I mean, it's kind of true, isn't it? A woman whispered, leaning closer to her companion. Claire said she was never really around. Always too busy or distant. A small pause. Then a quiet laugh. Well, at least she's good for something. I didn't turn my head. I didn't react. But every word landed exactly where it was meant to. Claire said. Of course she did. I let that settle for a moment, the way you let a bitter taste linger just long enough to recognize it. Then I placed my fork down carefully beside the plate, aligning it with the edge like I used to teach Emily when she was little. Across the room, I saw Claire again. This time, she wasn't smiling at guests. She was speaking to the wedding planner, her expression sharp, controlled. She gestured briefly in my direction, just a flick of her hand, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. And now, I was. A few minutes later, Daniel approached the head table where Emily and her new husband were seated. He leaned in, said something that made Emily laugh. Claire joined them, placing a hand gently on Emily's shoulder, her posture warm, maternal, practiced. Then Emily said something in return. I couldn't hear the words. But I saw it, the glance. All 3 of them looked toward me. Not long. Just enough. And then they smiled. Not kindly. Not warmly. But knowingly. That was the moment it stopped being a suspicion. It wasn't just Claire shaping the narrative. Emily knew. My granddaughter, the little girl who used to fall asleep on my couch with her head in my lap, knew exactly what that name tag said. And she had chosen to wear her white dress and say her vows under a roof built, in part, by my quiet sacrifices, while letting that message sit on my chest for everyone to read. I reached for my napkin and dabbed it lightly at the corner of my lips, though I hadn't eaten a single bite. 70 years teaches you many things. But one of the most important is recognizing the exact moment when love is no longer the thing holding a family together. Across the ballroom, the music shifted. A soft instrumental piece began to play as the MC stepped forward, announcing the next part of the evening. To the woman who made all of this possible, he began, smiling broadly as he scanned the room. A few guests turned instinctively toward the head table. Toward the bride. Toward her parents. But I noticed something else. The MC's eyes flickered. Just briefly. Toward me. And then, away. Like he'd been told where not to look. I sat very still, my hands folded once more in my lap, my back straight against the chair. Because now I understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't just a joke. Printed on cardstock. It was a story. Rehearsed. Shared. Agreed upon. And I had just been handed my role in it. The absent one. The one who didn't matter. The one they could quietly erase, while still using everything she had given. I let out a slow breath, barely noticeable. And for the first time that evening, I stopped wondering if it was intentional. Because it was. There's a certain kind of memory that doesn't fade with time. It sharpens. Sitting there in that ballroom, surrounded by soft music and polished smiles, I found myself drifting, not away from the moment, but deeper into it. Because suddenly, everything I was seeing had roots. This wasn't new. It had just never been this obvious before. I remember the first time Emily stayed with me for an entire summer. She was 8 years old, all elbows and curiosity, asking questions faster than I could answer them. Claire had just started a new job back then. Busy, demanding. She told me it would only be for a couple of weeks. It turned into 3 months. Every morning, I made her breakfast before she even came downstairs. Pancakes on Sundays. Oatmeal with honey on weekdays. She liked it just a little too sweet, and I always pretended not to notice when she added more. In the afternoons, we'd sit at the kitchen table doing her reading assignments. She struggled with certain words, would get frustrated, push the book away. "I'm not good at this," she'd say. And I'd gently turn it back toward her. "You're learning. That's different." By the end of that summer, she was reading full chapters on her own. Claire thanked me, briefly, when she came to pick Emily up. Said something about how helpful it had been. Helpful. That word felt small, even then. But I let it go. I always did. Years passed like that. Quiet contributions. Invisible support. When Daniel and Claire bought their first house, it was me who covered the closing costs they couldn't quite manage. "Just a loan," Claire had said quickly. I never asked for it back. When Emily wanted to join a private dance program in high school, tuition far beyond what her parents were willing to pay, it was me who wrote the checks. Month after month. Recital after recital. I sat in the audience every time, clapping until my hands stung. Claire rarely attended. Always something else. Something more important. And yet, somehow, I was the absent one. Back in the ballroom, I watched Emily laugh as one of her bridesmaids whispered something in her ear. Her head tilted back slightly, the same way it used to when she was a child. For a moment, the past and present overlapped so clearly it almost hurt. Almost. Because what I felt now wasn't quite pain. It was recognition. I thought about the holidays I'd hosted, the birthdays I'd planned, the quiet ways I'd stepped in whenever things began to fall apart. I had been the constant. The one who filled the gaps no one else noticed, because they never had to. And somewhere along the way, that had been rewritten. Not into something appreciated, but into something expected. And then, something dismissed. I looked down once more at the name tag pinned neatly to my dress. The letters hadn't changed. But my understanding of them had. Absent didn't mean I hadn't been there. It meant they had decided I didn't count. A subtle difference. But an important one. I lifted my gaze again, scanning the room slowly this time. The laughter, the music, the elegant decorations, it all continued exactly as planned. Because for them, nothing was wrong. This was the story they believed. Or at least, the one they were comfortable telling. I adjusted the cuff of my sleeve, smoothing it carefully, deliberately. Because if there's one thing life teaches you after a certain age, it's that people don't just forget what you've done for them. They choose what to remember. And sitting there at that table, surrounded by strangers at my own granddaughter's wedding, I realized something with a quiet, unshakable certainty. They hadn't just erased my place in their story. They had replaced it. It was sometime between the main course and dessert when someone finally sat down beside me. Not across the table. Not passing by. Beside me. I was wondering if you'd be here. The voice was low, familiar in a way that made me turn my head slowly. Martin Reynolds. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, more silver in his hair. Deeper lines around his eyes, but there was still that same steadiness about him. The kind that doesn't come from confidence, but from knowing more than you say. Martin, I said, offering a small nod. It's been a while. It has. He glanced briefly at my name tag. Not with surprise. Not with amusement. Just acknowledgement. Then he looked back at me. May I? I gestured lightly to the empty chair. He sat down without another word, placing his napkin neatly on his lap. For a moment, we both faced forward, watching the room move around us. You look well, he said after a pause. I've been told that before, I replied. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. Then it disappeared. I wasn't sure if you'd been informed, he said quietly. Informed about what? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a slim envelope. Plain. Unmarked. He placed it on the table between us. I wasn't supposed to bring this tonight, he said. But after what I've seen, his eyes flickered once more to my name tag. I thought you should have it. I didn't reach for it right away. What is it? Something your husband left behind. The words landed softly. But they stayed. My husband had been gone for 3 years. And yet, here he was again, in the middle of a room where I had just been reduced to a joke. I handled his estate, Martin continued. You remember that? I do. There were additional instructions. Contingencies. He was very specific. I finally placed my hand on the envelope. It was heavier than it looked. He didn't want them to know, Martin said. Not unless it became necessary. And now it is? I asked. Martin didn't answer directly. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his voice lowering just enough that no one else could hear. I've spent the last hour listening, he said. Observing. The way they speak about you. The way they've positioned you tonight. A brief pause. This wasn't an accident. I let out a quiet breath. No, I said. It wasn't. He nodded once, as if confirming something he had already decided. Your husband anticipated a shift, he said carefully. He hoped it would never happen. But he prepared for it anyway. My fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the envelope. What kind of preparation? Martin's gaze held mine now. Steady. Unwavering. The kind that changes outcomes, he said. Across the room, laughter rose again, bright, unaware. Someone clinked a glass. The music shifted into something lighter, more celebratory. Life, as they understood it, was continuing exactly as planned. But at this table, something had shifted. I picked up the envelope slowly, turning it over in my hands. Still sealed. Still waiting. For years, Martin added quietly, you've been very generous with this family. I didn't respond. You may want to reconsider who deserves that generosity. His words didn't sound like advice. They sounded like a door opening. I placed the envelope gently in my purse, my movements calm, deliberate. Then I looked back out at the ballroom. At Emily. At Daniel. At Claire. At the story they had written so carefully and presented so confidently. Absent old lady. I felt something settle again inside me. Not anger. Not hurt. Something clearer. Because for the first time that evening, I realized I wasn't the only one who had come prepared. I didn't open the envelope. Not right away. Instead, I sat there with my hands resting calmly in my lap, my purse closed beside me, as if nothing had changed. As if I were still just another guest at table 12. Because sometimes, the most powerful move is not reacting at all. Across the ballroom, the music shifted again. Softer now. Romantic. The kind that signals a transition. The first dance was about to begin. Guests started turning their chairs, angling their bodies toward the center of the room. Conversations quieted, replaced by anticipation. I followed their gaze. Emily stepped onto the dance floor with her new husband, her hand resting lightly in his. She looked radiant. Untouched by anything that had happened, or anything she had allowed to happen. For a moment, I simply watched. Then I reached for my glass and took a small sip of champagne. It was the first thing I'd tasted all evening. Crisp. Cold. Controlled. Much like the feeling settling inside me now. Beside me, Martin remained silent. He didn't rush me. Didn't ask what I was thinking. That was always his way. He understood that some realizations need space to fully arrive. I suppose, I said quietly, keeping my eyes on the dance floor, he always did think a few steps ahead. Martin gave a small nod. He did. I let that sit for a moment. Then I added, almost to myself, I just never thought I'd need to catch up. The music swelled slightly as Emily leaned into her husband, smiling up at him as if the world had aligned perfectly in her favor. Applause began to ripple softly through the room. I placed the glass back down. Carefully. Precisely. And then I did something small. So small no one would have noticed unless they were watching closely. I removed the name tag from my dress. Not abruptly. Not with frustration. Just a simple motion. A quiet decision. I held it between my fingers for a moment, looking down at the words again. The elegant script. The deliberate choice. The absent old lady. I turned it over once, then set it face down on the table. No announcement. No scene. Just removal. Beside me, Martin noticed. Of course he did. That seems appropriate, he said softly. I didn't respond. Because what I felt wasn't relief. It was clarity. For years, I had accepted the role they gave me. The quiet supporter. The one in the background. The one who filled the gaps without asking for recognition. And slowly, that role had been reshaped. From invisible to unnecessary. But sitting here now, with that envelope resting quietly in my purse, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. Roles can be reassigned. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But completely. The song came to an end, and the room filled with applause. Emily laughed, stepping back as guests began preparing for the next part of the evening. Speeches. Toasts. Public words. I glanced briefly toward the front of the room, where the microphone stood waiting. Then I looked back down at my hands. Still. Steady. For the first time that night. I wasn't wondering what they thought of me. I wasn't questioning where I stood. I already knew. And more importantly, I knew what I was going to do next. The Speeches began shortly after the first dance. One by one, people stepped up to the microphone, glasses raised, voices warm with practiced affection. Stories were told. Laughter followed. Applause came easily. From where I sat, it all looked seamless. Like a well-rehearsed performance. Emily's maid of honor went first, something light, playful, filled with inside jokes that made the younger crowd laugh a little louder than necessary. Then came one of the groomsmen, who spoke about loyalty and new beginnings, his words polished but distant. And then Claire stood up. She adjusted the microphone slightly, smoothing the front of her dress with a small, careful gesture. The room quieted almost instantly. Claire had always known how to hold attention. I just want to say, she began, her voice soft, almost emotional, that today is everything I ever hoped for my daughter. A pause. Perfectly timed. She's grown into a strong, independent woman, someone who knows how to build her own life, her own family. More nods. More smiles. I watched her closely now. Not as a mother-in-law. Not as someone trying to understand. But as someone finally, observing clearly. She didn't get here by chance, Claire continued. It took guidance. It took sacrifice. It took being present every step of the way. The word lingered. Present. I didn't move. Not a breath. Not a shift in posture. But inside, something aligned. Claire's eyes moved across the room, briefly scanning the tables before returning to the couple at the center. She didn't look at me directly. She didn't have to. The message had already been delivered. Subtle. Controlled. But unmistakable. She learned what family means, Claire said, lifting her glass slightly. Because we were always there for her. Applause followed immediately. Warm. Supportive. I joined in. 2 soft claps. Measured. Polite. Then I stopped. Because now, there was no confusion left. No lingering doubt. This wasn't just about a name tag. This was a narrative. Reinforced. Repeated. Shared openly, just beneath the surface of celebration. And everyone in that room had accepted it. Beside me, Martin shifted slightly in his chair. Not enough to draw attention, just enough that I noticed. You hear it now, he said quietly. I do. Another pause. And, he asked. I kept my eyes forward, watching as Claire stepped down from the stage, greeted by smiles, by hands reaching out to touch her arm, to affirm what she had just said. And now I understand why he prepared, I replied. Martin didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because the next name being called was mine. And now, the MC said, glancing briefly at his card, we'd like to invite Emily's grandmother to say a few words. A ripple moved through the room. Subtle, but present. Heads turned. Conversations paused. I could feel it, the shift. Curiosity. Expectation. Maybe even a hint of amusement. I stood up slowly. Not rushed. Not hesitant. Just deliberate. I smoothed my dress lightly, reached for the back of my chair, and stepped out into the aisle. From table 12, to the center of the room. Each step measured. Steady. Not one person spoke as I walked past. And for the first time that evening, every eye was on me. The room felt different as I reached the front. Not louder. Not quieter. Just focused. I could feel it in the stillness, the way conversations had stopped mid-sentence, the way glasses were held but not lifted, the way even the music seemed to fade into the background without anyone touching it. I stepped up to the microphone and adjusted it slightly. A small movement. Controlled. The kind that gives you a moment to look out and see clearly. Emily stood just a few feet away, her hand still resting in her husband's. Up close, I could see the details, the careful makeup, the soft shimmer of her dress, the expectation in her eyes. Not warmth. Expectation. Beside her, Claire stood tall, her posture perfect, her expression composed. But there was something else there now. Something tighter. Awareness. Daniel avoided my gaze entirely. His attention fixed somewhere just past my shoulder, as if looking at me directly might require something he wasn't prepared to give. I let the silence stretch for just a second longer. Then I smiled. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady, carrying easily across the room. "For inviting me to be here tonight." A few polite nods. A few soft smiles. "I've been thinking," I continued, my hands resting lightly on either side of the podium, "about what weddings are meant to represent." I paused, not because I needed to, but because they did. They're not just about two people coming together. They're about history. About everything that came before this moment. Every person who stood quietly behind the scenes, making sure that moment could happen at all. I saw it then, just a flicker. Claire's expression tightening for half a second before smoothing out again. I continued. "I remember when Emily was 8 years old," I said softly. "She used to sit at my kitchen table, struggling through her reading assignments. She'd get frustrated. Push the book away. Tell me she wasn't good enough." A few guests smiled faintly. The kind of reaction people give to a harmless memory. I used to turn the book back toward her and say, "You're learning." That's different. I let that settle. Because now, it meant something else. "I've had the privilege," I went on, "of watching her grow. Of being there for the quiet moments. The ones no one else sees. The ones that don't get photographed." A pause. My gaze moved briefly, not dramatically, just enough, to where Claire stood. "Those moments don't always look important at the time," I said. "They don't draw attention. They don't ask for recognition." Another pause. "But they build everything." The room had gone completely still now. No shifting. No whispers. Just listening. I straightened slightly, my voice remaining calm, even gentle. "And sometimes," I added, "the people who build the foundation aren't the ones who get remembered for it." A few glances exchanged between guests. Subtle. Curious. I could feel the shift beginning. Not loud. Not dramatic. But real. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't rush. Because this wasn't about making a scene. It was about telling the truth, in a room that had been carefully arranged to avoid it. I rested my hands lightly together. "And that's all right," I said quietly. "Because presence isn't something you announce." A small breath. "It's something you prove." I let the words hang there. Not heavy. Just undeniable. I let the silence settle after my last sentence. No one moved. No one interrupted. That was important. Because truth, when spoken calmly, doesn't need to be forced. It finds its place on its own. I reached into my purse then. Slowly. Deliberately. Not rushed. Not dramatic. Just precise. And I took out the envelope Martin had given me. A few people in the front rows leaned forward slightly. Not enough to be obvious, but enough that I noticed. Curiosity. I placed the envelope on the podium in front of me, resting my fingers lightly on top of it. "I wasn't planning to say much tonight," I continued, my voice even. "Weddings aren't the place for long speeches." A faint ripple of polite laughter. Brief. Uncertain. "But sometimes," I added, "they become the place where things finally make sense." I opened the envelope. Carefully. The sound of the paper sliding free seemed louder than it should have been. Or maybe the room had simply gone that quiet. Inside were a few documents. Clean. Official. Prepared. I didn't look down at them right away. Instead, I lifted my gaze back to the room. To those of you who don't know me, I said, my name is Margaret. A small pause. I'm Emily's grandmother. That part was obvious. But I'm also, I continued, the person who helped fund her education. Her extracurriculars. And, in part, this very evening. A shift. Subtle. But unmistakable. Eyes turned. Not just toward me now, but toward Claire. Toward Daniel. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. For many years, I said, I believed that support didn't need to be acknowledged. That showing up quietly was enough. I let that sit. Tonight, I learned something different. My fingers lightly tapped the edge of the document. That sometimes, stories are told in ways that leave things out. A longer pause this time. Because now, they were listening differently. I glanced briefly at the paper, then back up again. My late husband, I said, was a careful man. Thoughtful. Observant. I could see Martin in the corner of my vision. Still seated. Still watching. He believed in preparation. In making sure that what was built stayed protected. Claire shifted slightly. Just enough. Daniel finally looked at me. And before he passed, I continued, he put certain protections in place. The word landed. Protections. Not gifts. Not generosity. Something else. I lifted the document slightly, not to display it fully, just enough for it to be seen. These include provisions regarding financial contributions made to this family, I said. And how they are to be handled, moving forward. The room had gone completely still again. No whispers now. No movement. Just attention. Careful. Focused. I looked directly at Emily then. Not harshly. Not accusing. Just, clearly. Presence, I said softly, is not defined by who tells the story. A small breath. It's defined by what can be proven. I lowered the document back onto the podium. And tonight, I added, I simply wanted to make sure the full story was available. I stepped back slightly from the microphone. Not leaving yet. Just enough to let the weight of it settle across the room. I didn't say anything else for a moment. I didn't need to. The room had already changed. You could feel it, the shift moving quietly from table to table, from one expression to another. What had been light and effortless just minutes ago now felt measured. Careful. People were no longer just attending a wedding. They were thinking. I stepped back toward the microphone, just slightly, my hands resting calmly at my sides. My husband, I continued, my tone steady, believed that generosity should come from respect, not assumption. A pause. And that if respect was ever lost, I let the sentence hang for just a second. Then generosity should be reconsidered. There it was. Not loud. Not dramatic. But clear. Across the room, Claire's composure shifted for the first time. Not fully, but enough. Her smile no longer reached her eyes. Her shoulders, once relaxed, now held just a bit too straight. Daniel looked between us, uncertainty written plainly across his face. And Emily. Emily didn't smile at all. I turned slightly, allowing my gaze to pass over the room, not searching, not accusing, just acknowledging. For years, I said, I gave freely. Without conditions. Without expectation. I looked back toward the front. But. Going forward, another pause. That will no longer be the case. A soft murmur moved through the crowd. Not loud enough to interrupt, but impossible to ignore. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Effective immediately, I continued, all financial support connected to me will be reviewed and adjusted according to the terms outlined in these documents. I placed my hand lightly on the papers again. Some arrangements will end. Others will change. I let that settle. Because they understood. Not every detail. But enough. Claire took a small step forward then, as if she might speak, but stopped herself. The room wasn't hers anymore. Not in this moment. I looked at her briefly. Calm. Unmoved. Then back to Emily. This isn't about punishment, I said gently. It's about alignment. A small breath. About making sure that what is given where it is valued. No anger. No bitterness. Just truth. I stepped away from the microphone then. No dramatic exit. No lingering glance. Just a quiet step back. Because the decision had already been made. And for the first time that evening, I wasn't standing in the background of their story anymore. I stepped away from the microphone without looking back. No rush. No hesitation. Just a quiet return to where I had been sitting all evening. But nothing felt the same anymore. The room, once filled with easy laughter and polished conversations, now held something heavier. Not chaos. Not outrage. Awareness. People weren't speaking the way they had before. Their voices were lower. Their eyes moved more carefully. Some avoided looking toward the front altogether. Others didn't hide it, they watched openly now, studying the space between me, Claire, and Daniel as if trying to understand what had just shifted. Because something had. And everyone felt it. I reached my table and paused for a brief moment before sitting down. The chair hadn't changed. The setting was still the same: linen, glassware, untouched food. But I was no longer the same person sitting there. Across the room, Claire was the first to move. She stepped toward Emily quickly, her hand finding her daughter's arm, her lips forming words too quiet to hear. Emily shook her head once. Sharp. Immediate. Not confusion. Reaction. Daniel followed a second later, his expression strained, his posture uncertain in a way I had never seen before. He looked toward me briefly, just a glance, but this time, he didn't look away as quickly. There was something else in his eyes now. Not dismissal. Recognition. Near the front, a few guests began whispering. Not in the careless way from earlier, this was different. More contained. More cautious. A man leaned toward another and spoke while keeping his eyes forward. A woman beside him nodded slowly, her gaze drifting toward Claire, then back to her plate. The narrative had shifted. Not erased. Not undone. But questioned. Beside me, Martin remained seated, his hands folded neatly as if he had been there the entire time, which, of course, he had. You handled that well, he said quietly. I said what needed to be said, I replied. He gave a small nod. That's usually enough. I didn't respond. Because I wasn't watching him. I was watching them. Claire's composure was still there, but thinner now. More deliberate. The kind of control that takes effort to maintain. Emily stood still for a moment, then turned slightly, scanning the room, not for attention this time, but for something else. Reassurance. And Daniel. Daniel looked like a man trying to understand how something he had accepted so easily had just been undone in a matter of minutes. I folded my hands again in my lap. Calm. Still. No anger. No urgency. Because there was nothing left to prove. The room had already seen enough. And for the first time that evening, no one was looking at me like I didn't belong there. I didn't stay much longer after that. There was no reason to. The music eventually returned. Softer at first, as if the room needed permission to move on. Conversations resumed, though not quite the same as before. Laughter came back in pieces, careful, measured, like something being tested before it was fully trusted again. I sat for a while, watching it all settle into a new shape. Not broken. Just different. Emily never came over. Not during the rest of the evening. Not while I was there. But I saw her glance at me more than once. Not the quick, dismissive look from earlier. Something else. Something quieter. Claire stayed close to her, speaking often, her posture composed, her expression controlled, but there was an edge now. A tension that hadn't been there before. And Daniel. Daniel looked at me one last time as I stood to leave. This time, he didn't look away. I gave him a small nod. Nothing more. Because some conversations don't happen in words. I picked up my purse, smoothing the front of my dress out of habit. My fingers brushed lightly over the place where the name tag had been pinned earlier that evening. The fabric was still slightly marked where it had rested. A faint imprint. I paused for a second, then let my hand fall away. At the exit, the night air greeted me with a quiet kind of honesty. Cool. Steady. Unaffected by what had happened inside those walls. I stepped outside without hesitation. No one stopped me. No one called my name. And for the first time that evening. That felt exactly right. Martin caught up with me just as I reached the bottom of the steps. "Do you need a ride?" he asked. "I'll be fine," I said. "I've arranged one." He nodded, then paused. "He would have been proud of you." I looked out toward the street for a moment before answering. "He prepared me," I said quietly. Martin gave a small smile, then stepped back, allowing me the space to leave on my own. The car arrived a minute later. I got in, closing the door gently behind me. As we pulled away, I didn't look back at the hotel. I didn't need to. Because something had already closed behind me. Not a door slammed in anger. But one that had simply finished its purpose. For years, I had believed that being present meant staying. Showing up. Giving more. Holding things together, even when no one noticed. But tonight taught me something different. Presence isn't about where you stand in a room. It's about whether you are seen for what you truly are. And if you're not, you don't argue. You don't beg to be included. You step away. With clarity. With dignity. With everything that was always yours, still intact. As the city lights passed quietly outside the window, I rested my hands in my lap once more. Just as I had at table 12. Calm. Steady. But no longer waiting. Because I wasn't absent. I had simply been standing in the wrong place.